So after Balfour Declaration Day was celebrated yesterday, I asked the question, why all the festivities? Why all the happiness? You would think that massive achievement of the fulfillment of the Balfour Promise has been kept. It has not. The Balfour Declaration was a commitment, was a covenant to Jehovah, the Elohim of Israel, to return the Jews, or to make a homeland for the Jews in what the Romans labeled Palestine. And in so doing, a united Jerusalem would have to be under the control of the Jews. All of the land of Judea would also have to be under the control of the Jews. The British promised, at the very least, everything west of the Jordan River. But they promised more than that. But I won't get into the more than that. I say that they should have read Joshua 1 verses 1 and through 4 to find out what the proper borders of Israel was, and then carry it out. It was their responsibility, since they had the British mandate, and since the British mandate was reaffirmed and formalized by the League of Nations. The entire world had a responsibility to make sure it happened. But reneging after reneging after reneging took place. And once in 1937, following a 6-month-long Arab general strike and armed insurrection which aimed to pursue national independence and secure the country from foreign control, the British established the Peel Commission. The commission concluded that the mandate had become unworkable. Why? Because they tried to force the Jews and the Arabs to live together, knowing full well, reading the scriptures, that it was impossible. I could go on, and everyone should read this Wikipedia. But after that failure, then came to partitioning. An even worse crime against Israel's Elohim. And I think it was finalized it began October of 1947. Even after the mass murder of the Jews in Christian Europe. Yes, I said that word, Christian Europe. And I know there are some out there who will say, "Oh, Henry, no, that they weren't Christian." Oh, yes, they were. Unfortunately, murder, rape, pillage, and all sorts of mayhem was something that Christians loved to do. I will read an article. And yes, I am wearing this sackcloth and the star of the Jews in solidarity with the Jews and in protest against Christianity. The article, it's a very long one. We may be sitting here for a long time, but I have to do this. It is called Universal Declaration of Human Rights: Christianity and its Persecution of the Jews. So you want to call yourself a Christian? Be careful. You wouldn't call yourself a Nazi, would you? Well, of course not. You wouldn't call yourself a Maoist, would you? Of course you wouldn't. You wouldn't call yourself a Stalinist, would you? Of course you wouldn't. Now, you may say that the name of Christ is associated with the Hebrew Messiah. If that is the case, then why do you call this Hebrew Messiah by a Gentile name when he was given a Hebrew name? Why do you do that? Well, the answer is based on anti-Jew, anti-Hebrew, anti-Semitism. Now, so the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie, is quoted as saying the following: without centuries of Christian anti-Semitism, Hitler's passionate hatred would never have been so fervently echoed. Early Christians specialized in causing trouble at synagogues, disrupting Jewish services. Such behavior had been censured by the pagan emperors, but under Christian ones, official censure changed to tolerance and even encouragement. First nominally Christian Emperor Constantine was also the first significantly to limit the rights of Jews as citizens in the Roman Empire. He imposed heavy penalties on anyone who converted to Judaism and also on any Jewish community that received converts. In the next generation, any Christian converting to Judaism would have all his property confiscated. Marriages between Christians and Jews became capital offenses. In later centuries, the emperors became more strongly Christian, and the laws concerning Jews became correspondingly more discriminatory, intolerant, and oppressive. An important turning point came in AD 388. In that year, a synagogue at Rome was burnt by Christians, and the authorities required that restitution be paid. This was clearly fair and in keeping with custom, but in the same year, another synagogue in Callinicum on the Euphrates was razed by Christians at the instigation of the local bishop. Again, the emperor required the bishop to make restitution. The leading churchman of the day, Ambrose, now a saint and doctor of the church, interceded and made it clear to the emperor that it would be sinful to help the Jews in this way. The emperor acceded to the will of the church and withdrew his demand for justice. The Christian emperor Theodosius II promulgated a new code of law in AD 438, which excluded Jews from all political and military functions. They were again forbidden to marry Christians or to own Christian slaves, to hold public office or to build synagogues. In the same year of the Empress Eudoxia tried to relax the regulations which barred the Jews from Jerusalem except for the festival of Sukkot. When the Jews gathered on the Temple Mount, they were attacked by Christian monks. Many Jews were murdered. When some of the monks were brought for trial, the leader of the massacre, a monk called Barsauma, assembled his followers again. Now they threatened to burn the empress herself and inspired such fear that the proceedings had to be dropped. Barsauma later became Saint Barsauma. John Chrysostom, another Christian saint and a doctor of the church, was even more extreme. He claimed the Jews sacrificed their children to Satan, an accusation which was to be amplified and believed throughout Christendom for centuries. He also claimed that God hated the Jews and always had hated the Jews. His 8 sermons of 387 whipped congregations into frenzy of excitement and fanaticism. Jews were drunkards, whoremongers, and criminals. They were lascivious, obscene, demonic, and accursed. They murdered prophets, Christ, and even God himself. Before long, the sort of massacre of Jews by Christians, which in time would come to be known as pogroms, were being instigated by Christian leaders. St. Jerome regarded the Jews as vipers. St. Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, instigated a series of riots directed against them. Massacres and riots occurred elsewhere in the empire, but as so often, surviving records are patchy, and we have been so sanitized by Christian hands that they were unreliable. We also almost certainly never know how many Jews were murdered by Christians during the Dark Ages. Ain't that the truth? Under Emperor Justine I, from 518 through 27, Jews were forbidden to make wills, to receive inheritances, to give testimony in court, or to perform any other legal act. From now on, they would be second-class citizens. The next emperor, Justinian, produced a new code in AD 529 confirming their legal disabilities. This code would be influential for many hundreds of years. Up to the present day, through Gratian, marriage between Christian and Jew was confirmed as a capital offense. Synagogues were sequestered and converted into churches. The burning down of synagogues was also explicitly made legal. Many bishops and monks, now saints, holy in the eyes of Christians, took advantage of the revised law to commit acts of arson. In 538, a church council at Orleans again condemned intermarriage. It prohibited Christians and Jews eating together or mixing at all during Holy Weeks. Regulations affected all facets of life. Jews were not permitted to give medical aid to Christians, nor to receive it from them. By the end of the 6th century, they were being subjected to forcible baptism. And see, this, folks, is what I was talking about in previous videos about concerning some of the Amish, but that's another subject matter. A church council in Toledo in 694 declared all Jews to be slaves, their possessions were to be confiscated, and their children seized, to be converted to Christianity. By 1010, local Jewish populations were being routinely massacred in Europe, notably in Rome, Orleans, Rouen, Limoges, and throughout the Rhineland. Existing legal disabilities were confirmed by the Third Lateran Council in 1179, which added a further restriction that Jews should not receive feudal homage. Rhineland. Christians living with Jews were to be excommunicated, which explains why the Amish speak so much Yiddish. Once again, another subject matter, another day, and why the Amish were so mistreated in Europe. So this regulation directly led to the creation of Jewish ghettos. The justification for Jewish persecutions through the centuries has been a passage from the Matthew Gospel. After Pilate had denied responsibility for sentencing of Jesus, which is not his name is Yeshua or Yehoshua, in English Joshua, to death, the Jewish people are quoted as saying, "His blood be on us and our children." Matthew 27, verse 25. A similar theme may be found at 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 15. In Christian eyes, this meant that the Jews as a race were collectively responsible for the death, as they say here, Jesus, or as it rightly should read, Yehoshua. So, I'm going to stop right here for just a second and warn everyone that this judgment that the Christians placed upon the entire race of the Jews now falls on the entire Christian church because they made this judgment. I will continue. In time, the principle of collective guilt would open the way to the assignment of other imaginary forms of guilt. The fact that, as they say, Jesus, but Yehoshua had been a Jew, as his parents and his followers had been, was overlooked. In Christian art, the Jews were depicted as ugly and deformed, while their so-called Jesus was a handsome European. Yes. They changed his look. They changed his name because they weren't going to serve a Hebrew Messiah. In Western European art, Jesus' family was often depicted with blonde hair and blue eyes. The suggestion that Jesus might have looked anything like a typical Mediterranean Jew was tantamount to blasphemy. He was invariably depicted wearing at least a loincloth, not only to protect emerging concepts of Christian modesty, but also to hide the uncomfortable fact that he had been circumcised, as all Jewish boys were and still are at the age of 8 days old. Luke 2, verse 21. The apostles were also depicted as handsome Western Europeans, and I will add with long hair, which they did not have long hair. So these pictures of this so-called Jesus and the apostles are counterfeits. All except Judas, who was shown with caricatured Jewish features, who alone wore the yellow clothes that Jews were obliged by medieval Christians to wear. Artistic depictions of Satan also tended to show him with the caricatured Jewish facial features. Western Christians were not willing to accept the origins of their own religion for many centuries. A senior 19th century churchman, Dean Millman, became very unpopular for referring to Abraham as a sheikh. A provision in Deuteronomy 23 verse 20 permitted the Jews to make a profit from lending money to Gentiles. So it was that Jews were able to lend money in Christian Europe. This suited both Jews and Christians, and Jews were allowed into Christian countries in order to fulfill an essential economic function. As far as it is known, Jews were introduced into Britain soon after the Norman conquest to act as bankers to the king and his nobles. They were regarded as the king's property. In theory, enjoyed his protection, restricted to money lending. Jews were frequently accused of usury, though their rates of return were a fraction of those modern high street bankers. They were routinely cheated, abused, and humiliated, and the most preposterously calumnies were perpetrated against them. During Eastertide of 1144, a 12-year-old boy by the name of William was murdered near Norwich, probably by a local sexual deviant. Contrary to the available evidence, a monk, Thomas of Monmouth, formulated a theory that the boy had been ritually murdered by Jews. He claimed that they had crucified him just as they had crucified Jesus, overlooking the fact that crucifixion was a Roman, not a Jewish practice, and that there was no reason to suppose that the child had been crucified at all. Nevertheless, the story soon gained wide currency and came to be believed as fact. William was acclaimed Saint William, a martyr for the Holy Mother Church. His body was moved to Norwich Cathedral, where wondrous miracles were worked at his shrine, a circumstance which served to confirm the monk's story. Norwich profited enormously from the influx of pilgrims, all eager to learn the details of St. William's dreadful martyrdom, to witness his great miracles and make offerings. As the story spread and Norwich became rich, it must have occurred to others that they could cash in on anti-Semitism as well. In any event, there was an outbreak of such cases around the country. Gloucester, 1168. Bury St. Edmunds, 1181. Winchester, 1192. The victims of any and every child murderer were acclaimed by the church as victims of Jewish atrocities. Shrines were established, pilgrims arrived, miracles occurred. False miracles, folks. And money rolled in. When the Bishop of Norwich visited France in 1171, similar cases were suddenly reported there as well. Blois, or I guess I can't speak French, so it looks like Blois or Blois, 1171. Pontoise and Braisne, 1182. Another case was reported in Saragossa in the same year. Any murder without genuine suspect was likely to excite a new outbreak of unfounded rumor. When the body of a 9-year-old boy called Hugh was discovered down in the well in Lincoln in 1255, the stories of ritual murder were soon circulating again, and Jews were accused of crucifying him in the most unlikely circumstances. After torture sessions and a show trial, 19 Jews were executed, and many more suffered other punishments. Chaucer's Briers tale gives a chilling insight into Christian thinking about little Saint Hugh and demonstrates the use of anti-Semitic propaganda in skilled hands. Sometimes there was not even a murder victim to trigger the anti-Semitism. At the Blois, a servant of the mayor reported that he thought he saw a Jew throw a child's body into the river. No body was ever found, and no child was reported missing. Even so, 38 leading Jews were sentenced to death and burned. The calumny of the ritual child sacrifice, which came to be known as blood libel, was soon widespread throughout Europe. Jews were accused of torturing children, murdering them in ritual parody of Christian belief, then drinking their blood. Everywhere, Jews suffered torture and death because of these inventions. As the king's property, Jews in England had enjoyed a measure of protection, but when the king started taking their Christian duties seriously, they became less inclined to take care of their Jews. Jewish citizens who came bearing gifts for Richard I at his coronation in 1190 were massacred out of hand. Good King Richard, right? Their murder was acclaimed by churchmen as the judgment of God and was emulated in almost every other town in England with a Jewish community. When a massacre broke out in York, the Jewish population took refuge in a substantial building called the Clifford's Tower. There, their Christian neighbors besieged them, offering a choice between death and Christian baptism. Many chose to die by their own hand. Others gave themselves up to Christians only to be massacred on the spot, despite the promises. Those who had led the siege and massacre went to nearby York Minster, where they burned records of their debts to the people they had just murdered. They then left for the Third Crusade, safe in the knowledge that the church would forgive them, if indeed it felt it needed to. Groups of Jews were massacred by zealous Christians on a number of occasions like this. Sometimes one incident would spark off imitation pogroms throughout the country. In 1264, for example, there was a fresh outbreak of pogroms in London and other major towns during which many Jews perished. Jews suffered a number of indignities and disabilities. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 had disbarred them from holding land and all military and civil functions. It had required all Jews to wear distinctive clothing. At the insistence of the church, they were obliged to fast during Lent. They were debarred from practicing almost all trades, since trades were controlled by guilds. Guilds were essentially Christian organizations. They enjoyed the favors of patron saints. Their members built chapels. They put on annual religious plays. They would not permit Jewish members, and without membership, it was impossible to obtain an apprenticeship or to sell services. They were not allowed to buy or sell. Yes, that should ring a bell, folks. Boroughs obtained royal charters to allow them to exclude Jews from their environs. By 1271, the requirements of the church were being enforced in England, and Jews were prevented from holding land. They were also obliged to wear distinctive yellow badges as they were in continental Europe. It is sometimes claimed that anti-Semitism was a European phenomenon rather than a Christian phenomenon. But this is demonstrably not so. In the 9th century, senior churchmen like Agobard, Archbishop of Lyons, and Heinemar, Archbishop of Reims, worked hard campaigning against Jews who were already integrated into Carolingian society in Muslim Spain and in Cathar lands of the Languedoc. Jews had enjoyed much greater freedom than in Christendom. In Cathar lands, they were accorded civil rights and sat as elected consuls. They filled high offices for the counts of Toulouse and other potentates. The Easter tradition called Strike the Jew, popular throughout Western Christendom. Oh, you celebrate Easter, do you? If you do, you are an anti-Semite. This article says so. The Easter tradition called Strike the Jew, popular throughout Western Christendom, had been abolished in Toulouse in the middle of the 12th century despite protests of the clergy. One of the specific charges made by churchmen under Raymond VI of Toulouse was that he gave public office to the Jews. In 1209, stripped to the waist and barefoot, he was obliged to swear in front of a relic-laden altar in the presence of 19 bishops and 3 archbishops that he would no longer allow Jews to hold public office. In 1229, his son and heir, Raymond VII, underwent a similar ceremony in which he was obliged to prohibit the public employment of Jews. This time at Notre Dame in Paris. By the next generation, a new zealously Catholic ruler was arrested and imprisoning Jews for no crimes, raiding their houses, seizing their cash, and removing their religious books. They were released only if they paid a new tax. As an English historian of the Cathar Crusade puts it, organized and official persecution of the Jew became a normal feature of life in the South only after the Crusade, because it was only then that the church became powerful enough to insist on the application of positive measures of discrimination. Again, the Spanish Inquisition worked hard to introduce anti-Semitism into areas of Spain where Judaism, Islam, and Christianity had coexisted for centuries under convivencia. They introduced ghettos and enforced sumptuary laws, promoted mass expulsions, and encouraged racial discrimination. Other church officials spread blood libels and enforced prohibitions on admission of the Jews to colleges, military orders, professions, and trades. Just like Richard I, King of England, was a crusader. Oh, I should say, like Richard I, King Edward I was a crusader. His duty to God impelled him to travel to the Levant to kill God's enemies, the Muslim infidels. It occurred to him, as it occurred to other crusaders, that it was much easier to kill off God's other enemies, the perfidious Jewish infidels, without even crossing the channel. The problem was that they were funding the national debt. Eventually, to save himself from financial ruin, Edward confiscated the whole of their property and expelled them from the country in 1290. Even so, Christian propaganda kept alive the calumnies, and centuries later, English audiences would have been familiar with usurers like Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. Jews were not readmitted to England until Cromwell's protectorate, and they continued to suffer a number of legal disabilities up to the 19th century. Even after 600 years, the blood libel was still current in Britain. It surfaced, for example, during the spate of Jack the Ripper murders in Whitechapel in 1888. The murders were quite different from the ones in the Middle Ages. The charges of ritual murder were equally absurd, but they sounded just as convincing to receptive ears. In Europe, as in England, Jews were generally protected by the rulers whom they served. But if their usefulness ceased, or the debts owed to them became too great to repay, they, the Jews, became dispensable. Time after time, their property was confiscated and they were exiled. France, 1182, 1306, and 1396. Parma, 1488, Milan, 1490, Spain, 1492, Catalonia, 1493, Portugal, 1497. All the nobles had to do was withhold protection, and enthusiastic Christian hands would do the rest. Pogroms were a feature of European life throughout the Crusades everywhere. During the Shepherd's Crusade of 1251, the Jewish population of southern France was almost annihilated. The blood libel was popular almost everywhere. 180 Jews were burned at Munich at 1285 following a rumor that they had bled a child to death in their synagogue. In 1294, the blood libel was heard at Bern in Switzerland. Some Jews were executed, the rest expelled from the city. Later, a fountain was erected showing a sinister-looking Jew eating one child and carrying a sack full of others. In 1475, most of the Jews in the town of Trent of the Tyrol were tortured and burned following reports that a child named Simon had been ritually murdered. The Christian population had been whipped into a murderous frenzy by a preacher, Fra Bernardino da Feltre, who had accused Jews of ritual murder by his Lenten sermons that year. Through his inflammatory preaching, Bernardino went on to secure the expulsion of Jews from Perugia, Brescia, Gubbio rioting in Florence and in Forli. The raising of the synagogue at Ravenna, Simon was duly beatified by the church, and the usual selection of miracles were reported at his shrine. His cult continued officially until 1965. The doctrine of transubstantiation, affirmed by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, led Catholics to believe that the bread used at the Mass changed into Jesus' flesh. The word host, a term for sacrificial victim, was and still is applied to this bread. Within a few years, stories were spreading that Jews were stealing wafers of bread and torturing them in order to torture Jesus. A common story was that they pushed nails through the bread, making it bleed in imitation of the crucifixion, a practice known as host nailing. Sometimes the bread even cried out in pain. The stories like this led to Jews being sent to the stake throughout Europe. The first victims, apparently in 1243 at Berlitz in Germany, in 1298, a host nailing story was spread by a priest at Nuremberg, as a result 628 Jews lost their lives. In the same year, a knight by the name of Rindfleisch was responsible for the extermination of 146 Jewish communities in revenge for fancied affronts to the host. In 1337 at Deggendorf in Bavaria, the entire Jewish population was burned following the circulation of such stories. The church there commissioned a number of paintings showing Jews torturing the host with thorns and with hammers and with nails. Thousands of pilgrims traveled to see the pictures until they were withdrawn in the 1960s. Similar massacres took place elsewhere, and imaginative pictures were commissioned to lend credibility to the imaginary events that had precipitated them. Generally, they showed blood flowing from the tortured wafers of bread. A bleeding host was found in the home of a Jew in 1338. As a result, of which several Jewish communities in Lower Austria and Moravia, between 100 and 500 Jews, were mutilated and killed in Brussels in 1370. After someone reported seeing a Jew break a wafer, 41 were burned to death at Breslau in 1453 after a woman reported seeing a Jew stab a wafer. Confessions were obtained by use of torture. Such confessions led to the burning of 27 Jews at Mecklenburg in 1492. 38 were burned at Berlin in 1510 on the strength of a single confession obtained under torture. The last known execution of Jews for host nailing took place at Nancy in 1761. Another fanciful idea was that the Jews plotted to poison the wells. In 1161, 86 Jews had been burned for this in Bohemia. 160 Jews had been burned at Chinon in 1321 as accomplices of the lepers who had supposedly planned to poison the whole of France. Some years later, 40 Jews had committed suicide at Vitry in order to avoid the same fate. When the Black Death ravaged Europe between 1348 and 1351, Jews provided convenient scapegoats. The theory was that they provoked it by poisoning water wells. Now it was the Jews who were primarily held responsible, and the lepers who were their accomplices at Strasbourg. 2,000 Jews were burned alive. At Mainz, some 6,000 were slaughtered in a single day, the 24th of August in 1349. Elsewhere, Jews were walled up in their homes and left to die of starvation. Around 10,000 Jews, representing around 80 communities, were murdered in Bavaria. The entire Jewish population of Basel was wiped out. 600 adults went to the stake. Their children were given to Christians for forcible conversion. Invariably, the church was invoked one way or another, sometimes through the priests, sometimes the monks, sometimes through rampaging mob of penitents, known as flagellants. These flagellants literally whipped themselves into a religious frenzy. They were responsible for a Jewish massacre at Frankfurt in July 1349. Sometimes their mere approach precipitated violence. Anticipating the arrival of flagellants in the same year, Christians at Brussels killed 600 Jews. Within the space of 3 years, from 1348 to 1350, there were 350 known Jewish massacres. No, not 300 known killed. No, 300 different massacres. 350. But there may have been many more. As in England, continental crusaders often started with a massacre of local Jews. Then they set off for the Holy Land. On their way to the First Crusade in 1095-96, various groups fired by the oratory of preachers massacred any Jew that they came across. A group of Normandy attacked Jews in Rouen. A priest called Volkmar led a group of Saxon crusaders in the massacre of Jews in Prague. Another priest called Gottschalk led the massacre of Jews in Regensburg. Crusaders from Flanders attacked Jews in Cologne. A group of Lorraine attacked those in Metz. Another group attacked Jews in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And in Worms, around half the Jewish population was slaughtered. The survivors asked the local bishop to save them. He said he would do so only if they agreed to become Christians, and left them to consider. As happened in other such situations in towns throughout Europe, they committed mass suicide rather than convert. The men killed their children, then their wives, one a new bride, then each other. The last man left alive then killed himself. Successful crusades not only started with massacres of Jewish communities, they ended with them as well. The general pattern followed the great crusader success. When the crusaders took Jerusalem, they pursued the Jewish population into their synagogue, and then they set light to it, burning them alive. Sprees of murder and arson were led by priests, and the same pattern was repeated every time a new crusade was preached. As one influential abbot, Peter of Cluny, pointed out, it was expensive in men and money to travel to the end of the world to fight Mohammedans, yet there were infidels living locally who were far more guilty towards Christ. The implication is that it would be much cheaper, easier, and safer and worthier to massacre local Jews than to attack distant Christians who were likely to fight back, implying that the Jews didn't fight back. Preachers promoted the Second Crusade, prompting massacres across Germany and France. Jewish literature was also a common target. Book burning was widespread and endorsed by the church. Pope Gregory IX ordered the Talmud to be burned throughout Christendom. Tens of thousands of copies of it and other rabbinical writings were destroyed. One reason for this Holocaust, oh yes, did I mention there were many Holocausts? I think I did before. Was a suspicion that the Talmud contradicted Christian belief concerning the virgin birth of Jesus. The Crusader King Louis IX of France, now called St. Louis, or in the United States, St. Louis, was also worried by the danger of Jews denying the virgin birth. If Christian laymen heard a Jew denying the virgin birth or otherwise slandering the Christian faith, they should, said the future saint, run him through with a sword on the spot. Like other minority groups, prostitutes, Muslims, lepers, and reformed heretics, Jews were required to wear distinctive clothing to act as a badge of infamy. In France and Spain, this was generally a round yellow patch called a ruelle. In Italy, ruelles, circular red badges, and yellow hats were all used. In England, it was a saffron badge shaped like the twin tablets of Moses. In Germany, Austria, and Poland, Jews traditionally wore a pileum cornutum, a conical hat known in Germany as a Juden hat. Interesting. Juden hat. I'm going to save this and look up what a Juden hat looked like, because this is probably the first time that I have seen this. I guess it was a horned skull cap. Interesting. Often white or yellow, worn by Jews in medieval Europe and some also of the Islam world. I will continue. In 1233, in a letter to German bishops, an effort was then made to bring them into line and wear badges. Jews were required to pay an annual fee for their ruelles, and they also were effectively being required to pay for being persecuted. Persecution was popular at all levels within the church, but the main proponent were the mendicant orders, Dominicans and Franciscans. They invented pretexts to justify persecution. They ran the Inquisition. They enforced the rules. They promoted the burning of Jews and Jewish writing. They engineered ever more severe restrictions. They encouraged forcible conversions and preached anti-Semitism to the populace. They acted against Jews and other minority groups as the shock troops of the church. Roman popes also promoted the persecution of the Jews. Callistus III, 1455 to 1458, for example, revived legislation prohibiting social contacts between Christians and Jews. Paul IV, 1555 to 1559, hated them. As a cardinal, he had ordered the burning of Jewish books 2 months after his election as Pope. He published his Bull Cum Nimis Absurdum, a document which was to promote anti-Semitism for centuries to come. He claimed that Jews were slaves by nature and that they should be treated as such. In Rome, throughout the Papal States, they were confined to specific districts, each with a single entrance, which are now known as ghettos. The term ghetto is taken from the name of the district in Venice where the Jews had been confined by the Senate in 1516. Jews were forced to sell their houses at a fraction of their worth, forbidden to engage in commerce, and obliged to wear badges of infamy in public. They were obliged to use Latin and to attend church sermons for their conversion. The only trade open to them was the buying and selling of second-hand clothes and old iron, which largely explains why Jews were traditionally associated with the rag and bone trade and continued to be associated within living memory. Once again, Jews were forbidden to receive medical attention from Christians. Synagogues were destroyed. Paul's restrictions were enforced more or less by popes for many centuries. Paul's restrictions, what does that mean? If they're referring to the Apostle Paul, they need to read Romans 11. But anyway, I will continue. Elderly Jews were kidnapped from their ghetto during the Roman carnival, forced at sword point to overeat and then to race against each other. If 2 Christians testified that a Jew had insulted the Roman Catholic faith or a priest, he could be put to death. Neither was this sort of attitude restricted to the Middle Ages. Leo XII, from 1823 to 1829, once again forcibly confined the Jews to ghettos and subjected them to Inquisition. His Holiness also condemned a new Austrian constitution because it countenanced Jews running their own schools and colleges. As of late 1852, Pius IX had persuaded Tuscany to prohibit Jewish physicians from practicing medicine. Catholic authorities had for centuries been forcibly removing Jewish children from their parents in order to give them up to bring them up as Christians. The whole civilized world was shocked to discover that this was still happening in 1858 when Edgardo Mortara was seized in Bologna and sent to Rome. See page 310. I don't know where this article came from, but I will continue reading. His Holiness refused to yield to world opinion, and after a triumphal parade through the ghetto in Rome, Edgardo began a new life. The church's argument was that several years earlier, a Christian maid had secretly baptized the infant Edgardo when he was thought to be dying, so he was already a Christian. In the future, the church would be more circumspect in removing children from their parents. Though it continued to do so well into the 20th century. As for the ghettos, it was not until 1870, when Italian troops forcibly took Rome, the last remnant of the Papal States, that Jews were released from the last ghetto in Europe. One of the first acts of the new Italian government after the liberation of Rome was to tear down the ghetto walls. Wherever Christianity flourished, so did anti-Semitism. A clerical revival in France in the 1890s was linked to the Dreyfus Affair, during which a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason by the Christian establishment. It was left to a small number of freethinkers such as Emile Zola to help him, as it was to help other Jews when falsely accused. When it became clear that a miscarriage of justice had taken place, La Civiltà Catholica commented that if a judicial error had indeed been committed, then the Assembly of 1791 was responsible when it accorded French nationality to Jews. Father Vincent Bailey, editor of La Croix, claimed that the church in France was undergoing a punishment reminiscent of Christ's own passion, betrayed, sold, jeered at, beaten, covered with spittle, and crucified by the Jews. Anti-Semitism was still widespread at the beginning of the 20th century. In Limerick, in Ireland, the Jewish community were boycotted, stoned, and beaten and robbed, and eventually driven out of the city in 1904. The man behind it was Father John Crea, a priest who accused the Jews each Sunday from his pulpit of a range of offenses from deicide to conspiracy with Freemasons. Included was the accusation that Jews were given to murdering Christians, an echo of the old blood libel. Jews were persecuted in Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe. Hundreds of thousands of them were murdered in Christian pogroms in Eastern Europe over the centuries. In 1723, the Bishop of Gdansk in Poland demanded the expulsion of Jews from the city. When the city authorities declined, he exhorted a mob to break into the city ghetto and beat the residents to death. Such pogroms continued until recent times. Often the murders were justified by the old blood libel. Familiar charges of the ritual murder of children were heard from the Protestant church chaplain, Adolf Stoker, at Berlin in 1892, and again in the Hilsner trial of Slovakia in 1900, at the Bialis trial in Kiev in 1913. The general pattern is that the stronger the Christian faith, the stronger the persecution of the Jews. It has noted that pogroms have become common in Poland during its periodic intervals of that country's independence, when the church had enjoyed its greatest power and influence. The restoration of the independence to Poland in 1918, for example, was followed by an immediate return to traditional practices and outbreak of pogroms. Polish Catholics may not have welcomed domination by Hitler's Third Reich, but very few quarreled with the Nazis' attitude toward the Jews. Many Roman Catholics in Poland saw their Jewish neighbors carted off to death camps and were often not at all averse to helping them on their way. After the war, when Jewish refugees returned to their homes and businesses, Christian Poles reacted in the traditional way. They circulated stories of the ritual murder of children, the ancient blood libel yet again, and instigated the massacre of the refugees. In Kielce, 42 Jews, some of them recently freed from Nazi death camps, were murdered by their Christian neighbors. Like their Catholic brethren, Orthodox Christians thrived on anti-Semitism for centuries. In Ukraine, for example, numerous massacres were perpetuated in the mid-17th century. Orthodox Ukrainians took the opportunity to massacre some 100,000 Jews, represented around 300 communities, while rebelling against their Polish rulers. In 1801, Orthodox priests in Bucharest used traditional blood libel to whip up Christian sentiment, which resulted in Jewish quarter being attacked, and in 128 inhabitants having their throats cut. Jewish persecution was common under the Russian Orthodox Church right up until the Russian Revolution in 1918. Cossacks and their other Orthodox troops killed around 60,000 Jews in Eastern Europe during the Revolution itself. Protestants also found Jewish persecution and genocide to be entirely compatible with their faith. After all, the New Testament had referred to the Jews as children of the devil, which the Christians mistranslated. Justice was routinely denied by Protestants even up to recent times. Luther's anti-Semitic writings, such as About the Jews and Their Lies in 1543, were frequently quoted by the Nazis to justify their actions. Julius Streicher, the editor of the anti-Semitic Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer, cited Luther in justifying his own conduct in the court at Nuremberg in 1946. Luther had recommended that Jewish schools and synagogues be burned down, their houses destroyed, their books should be seized, public prayer or teaching should be punished by death. They should not be allowed to walk out on the street, their wealth should be confiscated. He recommended forced labor, or better still, expulsion from the country. It was almost not a Nazi textbook. As a Jewish historian has noted, because of his views, Protestants became even more anti-Semitic than Roman Catholics. So you want to say, well, I'm a Protestant. I am not of that, the Catholic anti-Semitism. Well, according to this article, the Protestants were even worse. In the 20th century, German Protestants were still keen to follow his advice. The Nazis realized all of Luther's dreams. Helped by Deutsche Christen and other Christian churches, the Deutsche Christen were Nazi Protestants who dominated the Protestants in Germany. During World War II, over half of the German Landeskirchen were Deutsche Christian, but other Protestant churches held similar views. Here is part of a declaration made by the president of the German Protestant churches in 1941. The National Socialist leaders of Germany have provided indisputable documentary evidence that the Jews are responsible for this war in its worldwide magnitude. They have therefore made the necessary decisions and taken the necessary steps both internally and external to ensure that the life of the German nation is protected against Judaism. As members of the same German nation, the undersigned leaders of the German Evangelical Church stand in the forefront of this historical struggle to defend our country, because of which it has been necessary for the national police to issue a statement to the effect that the Jews are the enemies of the German nation and of the world, just as it was also necessary for Dr. Martin Luther to demand on the basis of his own bitter experience that the severest measures should be taken against Jews and that they should be expelled from all German countries. Christian baptism does not change in any way the Jews' racial character. In other words, what he was saying is that even baptism, Christian baptism, doesn't change a Jew. His membership of the Jewish people and his biological nature. It is the duty of German Evangelical Church to foster and promote the religious life of the German people. Christians who are Jews by race have no place in that church and no right to a place. The undersigned leaders of the German Evangelical Church have therefore decided not to accept Jewish Christians as members of the church community. And this was far more unusual. Other Protestants who did not support Hitler joined the so-called confessing church and in the main kept their views to themselves. After the war was over and danger passed, the leaders of the confessing church made a declaration of their own guilt. These were anti-Nazis. They confessed their own guilt to the Council of World Churches, a gesture which was at least more than other churches were prepared to do. The Catholic Church had earned as bad a reputation during the Nazi era, but no declaration of guilt was forthcoming from its head, Pius XII, from 1939 to 1948. Pius appeared to many to have supported the great dictators. His Holiness never once equivocally condemned the victimization of the murder of Jews or the Third Reich, despite being blessed with direct communication with the divine, with his supernatural visions. During the war, he never made any statement that would give guidance to the many Catholics in the fascist and Nazi armies, as he could have done without endangering himself. Catholics engaged in genocide were never once informed by the church or the so-called Pope that what they were doing was wrong. In the whole of Christendom, only a handful of churchmen stood up to the Nazis. Altogether, over 6 million Jews died, including 1 million children. As historians have observed, it is difficult to see how the attempted murder of an entire people could take place without the highest moral authority on earth voicing an explicit criticism to it. Though His Holiness failed consistently to condemn Jewish or Nazi atrocities, he was content to continue referring to perfidious Jews after the war. He even condemned the concept of collective guilt as applied to the German people. To many, this was the ultimate irony, since the church's persecution of the Jews had for centuries been based upon the principle of collective guilt. Pius' successor, John 23, admitted church guilt in a sort of a code favored by the theologians. The mark of Cain is stamped upon our foreheads. Across the centuries, our brother Abel, as I have in many of my videos, showed the concept of Cain and Abel. Abel being, from Constantine onward, being the Jew, and the Christians being Cain. The mark of Cain is stamped on our foreheads across the centuries. Our brother Abel is slain in blood, which we drew, and shed tears we caused by forgetting thy love. Forgive us, Lord, for the curse we falsely attributed to their name as Jews. Forgive us for crucifying thee a second time in their flesh. For we knew not what we did. Unfortunately, this man failed to read what one of the apostles said about crucifying the Messiah afresh. There is no more forgiveness for crucifying the Messiah afresh. This may mean we admit responsibility for centuries of persecution and murder, but it is difficult to be certain. In 1958, His Holiness removed the reference to perfidious Jews from the Good Friday liturgy of the Roman Church. In 1965, the Second Vatican Council reconsidered the question of collective guilt and exonerated the Jews from collective responsibility for the death of Jesus, but only on condition that they disassociate themselves from the supposed wicked generation of the time of the crucifixion. Very rarely a senior churchman will now admit to his church's complicity. Cardinal Franz Koenig, for example, confirmed in 1988 that the Catholic Church in Austria bore part of the responsibility for Nazi crimes against the Jews and admitted that anti-Semitism was linked to Catholic education practices. During a Passover meal, many Jews still leave their doors open, as they have done for centuries. One traditional reason is to allow anyone who wants to see what is happening, and in particular to see their Christian children are not being murdered. Churches still apparently do their part to foster hatred and distrust. A detailed study in 1966 revealed that a significant amount of anti-Semitism in American Christians was due to church teachings. The doctrine of collective guilt was found to be still popular, and a statement that Jews can never be forgiven for crucifying Christ was subscribed to by 46% of Roman Catholics, 60% of Protestants, and 86% of Southern Baptists. Shame upon all of you. The Anglican Church stays silent about the martyrdom of St. William of Norwich and little St. Hugh of Lincoln. There are many miracles still stand testimony to the Christian faith. At the time of writing, there is a notice put up by the cathedral authorities by the remains of the shrine of little St. Hugh and Lincoln Minster. It frankly concedes that the story of little St. Hugh and other such stories were fictions. It goes on to suggest a prayer, not as one might expect for the victims of Christian persecutions, nor even for their forgiveness. It just simply asks God to forget about it. Remember not, Lord, our offenses nor the offenses of our forefathers. Well, folks, I'm going to go to one scripture. Oh, come on, computer. Okay. Hebrews 6, verse 4. For it is impossible for those who were once enlightened and have tasted of the heavenly gift, who were made partakers of the Holy Spirit and had tasted the good word of Elohim and the powers of the world to come, who were made knowledgeable of the kingdom to come. If they shall fall away or rebel, and then renewed again unto repentance, seeing they crucify to themselves the Son of Elohim afresh, to put him into open shame. For the earth which drinks in the rain and comes oft upon it and brings forth herbs, meet for them by whom it is dressed, receives blessing from Elohim. But that which beareth thorns and briers, we just read about those who bear thorns and briers. To them they are rejected. They are near unto cursing, whose end is to be burned. There you have it, folks. Those of you who claim that Paul taught against the Jews, you need to read Romans 11 especially. 11:26. Read it. Romans 11:26.